We found Martinez at dawn, standing waist-deep in the delta mud, staring at nothing. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't move. When we finally pulled him out, his rifle was empty, all 20 rounds fired into the water. But there was no blood, no bodies, just those tracks leading into the mangrove swamp. Tracks that shouldn't exist. Three-toed, clawed, almost human-sized, but wrong. The company medic said Martinez was in shock, but shock doesn't explain what he kept whispering for the next 6 hours. They walked like men. They had scales. They took Johnson. We'd written Johnson off as MIA after the ambush 3 nights prior. Charlie got him, we assumed. But Martinez's story didn't match any Viet Cong tactics I'd ever heard of. And when we went back to look for those tracks, we found something else. Something that made me realize the war in the Mekong wasn't just against an enemy we could see. They flew us into the Delta in mid-September, right at the end of monsoon season. The whole region was still half underwater, a maze of channels and rice paddies and mangrove swamps that went on forever in every direction. Green-black water everywhere, thick with sediment and God knows what else. The smell hit you first, rot and salt and fish and human waste all mixed together in the humid air. Breathing felt like drowning slowly. Our mission was simple on paper. Observe enemy supply routes, report movements, stay invisible. Reality was harder. The Delta didn't want you invisible. It wanted you gone. Leeches found their way into your boots within an hour. Mosquitoes formed clouds so thick you'd breathe them in. The mud had suction like it was trying to pull you down into whatever was beneath. But the worst part was how alive it felt. Not alive like a forest back home, with birds and deer and the occasional bear. Alive like something was watching. Always. The local Vietnamese felt it too. I noticed it the first day when we passed through a village to link up with our interpreter. Old women would glance at the water and make quick gestures, not quite the sign of the cross, but close. Kids played everywhere except near the canal banks. Nobody fished after dark, even though that's when the water was calmest. Our interpreter was a thin guy named Thuan who'd worked with American units for 2 years. Good English, reliable intel, never spooked. But when I asked him about the water, why nobody went near it at night, his face went blank. He said something about crocodiles. I'd seen crocodiles. The look in these people's eyes wasn't about crocodiles. It should have been my first real warning. It took less than a week for the warning signs to become impossible to ignore. We spent the first week learning the terrain, mapping patrol routes through the channels and identifying positions where we could observe without being seen. The team was small, just 6 of us. There was Phillips, our radio operator, a kid from Oregon who never stopped talking. Davis handled Point, a wiry North Carolina farm boy who could move through the swamp without making a sound. Jenkins was our medic, steady hands, quiet. The lieutenant was career Army, by the book, and I never learned his first name. We just called him Lieutenant. And then there was me, carrying the rifle and trying not to think about Gunny Hernandez's stories. The Delta had rhythms you learned fast. Mortar fire in the distance every afternoon around 1500 hours. Sampans moving along the main channels at dawn and dusk. Firefights that erupted suddenly and ended just as quick. But there were other rhythms underneath, harder to name. The way the insects would go silent in certain areas. How the water would ripple when there was no wind. Places where the air felt heavier, like the humidity had weight. We found the tracks on day 5. Davis spotted them first, pressed into the mud along a canal bank where we'd set up an observation post. 3-toed, deep impressions, deeper than a man's boot would make. Each toe ended in what looked like a claw mark. The stride length was wrong, too long for a human, too narrow for a water buffalo. "Croc tracks," Phillips said, but he didn't sound convinced. Davis knelt down, measured the print with his hand. Crocs don't walk on two legs. The tracks led from the water up into the grass, and then back to the water 20 meters downstream. Whatever made them had come up onto land, moved parallel to the canal, then returned, deliberately, like it was patrolling. LT studied them for a minute, then ordered us to move to a different position. He didn't say why. We didn't ask. That night, back at our temporary base in an abandoned village, I asked Tuan about the tracks, showed him a sketch Davis had made. His reaction was immediate. He looked away, shook his head, said he didn't know. But his hands were shaking when he lit his cigarette. "You've seen these before," I said. He smoked half the cigarette before answering. "My grandfather's village, near Cantho, when I was small. We had a rule: nobody near the water after dark. Not fishermen, not children, nobody. Why? Because of what lives there. What lives there?" He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not fear exactly, something older. Things that were here before people. Things that don't leave. I waited for him to continue, but he just finished his cigarette and walked away. The sound started that same night. I had first watch, 2200 to 0200, posted up on the second floor of a half-collapsed building that gave us a view of the main channel. Phillips was asleep below. Davis and Jenkins were at the other observation point across the village. Everything was quiet, that delta quiet where even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. Then I heard it, a wet dragging sound from the canal. Rhythmic, something moving through shallow water but not swimming. The sound would stop, then start again. Stop, start, unlike footsteps. I raised my rifle, flipped on the starlight scope, scanned the water. Nothing, just black surface reflecting the moon. But the sound continued, moving along the canal from south to north. I could track it by ear, passing right below my position. Whatever it was stayed in the water, just beneath the surface. Then it stopped directly below me. I held my breath, listened. For maybe 30 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then I heard something else, a long, low exhalation. Not quite a hiss, not quite a breath, something between. The water rippled once, and whatever it was moved on, continuing north until the sound faded completely. I didn't report it, didn't know how. But 3 days later, we found proof that something was hunting in the delta, and it wasn't just hunting us. The Viet Cong camp appeared 3 days later, and it was all wrong. We'd gotten intelligence about enemy activity 2 kilometers west of our position, so LT decided we'd do a recon sweep at first light. The camp sat on a small island in the middle of a wide channel, accessible only by boat or by wading through chest-deep water. Perfect defensive position. According to our intel, at least a dozen Viet Cong had been operating out of there for weeks. We approached from the east, moving slow through the mangroves. Davis went first, testing each step, making sure we didn't walk into booby traps. The silence was the first indicator something was off. No voices, no cooking fires, no movement at all. The camp was abandoned, but not in any way I'd seen before. Usually when Charlie pulled out of a position, they were methodical about it. You took their weapons, their supplies, left nothing useful behind. This looked like they'd run. Rice bags split open, contents spilled across the ground. Hammocks still strung between trees, one of them torn down the middle. A cooking pot overturned, whatever had been in it now covered in ants. And most strange, ammunition scattered in the mud, not spent casings, live rounds, A K-47 bullets just lying there like someone had dropped them while loading magazines. "They left in a hurry," Jenkins said quietly. Phillips found the first real evidence near the water's edge. 4 gouges in a wooden post that supported one of the shelters. Deep parallel grooves, each one about as long as my finger. They started high, maybe 7 feet up, and dragged downward, splintering the wood. And what the hell makes marks like that? Phillips ran his finger along one of the grooves. Not bullets, not shrapnel. The wood was carved away, torn, like something with claws had grabbed the post and pulled. LT ordered us to search the rest of the camp. We found more damage. A metal ammo box crushed inward, the sides buckled like something had squeezed it. Boot prints in the mud heading toward the water, then stopping abruptly at the edge. No prints coming back out. And near what must have been their sleeping area, we found blood. Not much, just dark stains on the ground and splattered on the base of a tree. But it was fresh enough that flies were still working it. No bodies, though, no weapons, no shell casings from a firefight, just evidence that something violent had happened here and the Viet Cong forces had either fled or been taken. We reported the camp abandoned and moved on. But that night, back at our position, I couldn't stop thinking about those claw marks, about the blood with no bodies, about how the Viet Cong, hardened soldiers who'd been fighting in this delta for years, had left ammunition behind. The next morning, we had a scheduled meeting with an ARVN unit operating in the same area. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, our South Vietnamese allies. Their commander was a captain who spoke decent English and had been running operations in the Delta since the early 60s. When LT mentioned the abandoned Viet Cong camp, the captain's expression changed. "You found the one near the Twin Channels? On the island?" "That's the one." The captain was quiet for a moment. Then he said something in Vietnamese to one of his men, who nodded and walked away quickly. "My soldiers will not patrol that area anymore." "Why not?" Lieutenant asked. "Because 3 nights ago, we heard shooting from that direction. Automatic weapons fire. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes, then screaming, then nothing. We assumed it was an American airstrike. There was no airstrike." "No," the captain said. I did not think so. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it with hands that weren't quite steady. "We lost a patrol last month. 4 men. They were tracking Viet Cong along the southern channel, radioed in their position at dusk, said they would return at dawn. We never heard from them again. We found their radio 3 days later, smashed. And we found tracks. Large tracks. Not human." "What kind of tracks?" The captain looked at me directly. "The kind that my father told me about when I was a boy. The kind that old men in the villages still talk about. Goi Rong, dragon people. Things that live in the deep water and come out to hunt when the sun is gone." He finished his cigarette and ground it out under his boot. "Your Lieutenant Hernandez was not crazy, if that is what you are wondering. Many men have seen them. We just do not write it in the reports." That was the moment I stopped dismissing what I'd heard on watch. Stopped looking for rational explanations. Because if the Viet Cong were running from something, and the ARVN wouldn't patrol certain areas, then we were all afraid of the same thing. 2 days later, we rotated back to the main firebase for resupply and briefing. The firebase sat on slightly higher ground. Relatively speaking, everything in the Delta was wet, and housed maybe 200 personnel at any given time. It had the usual: sandbag bunkers, a landing pad for choppers, rows of tents, and a small operations center where intel guys pored over maps and radio transcripts. I was heading to the mess tent when I saw him. Old guy, maybe 60, sitting outside the operations center with a cup of coffee and a cigarette. Weathered face, the kind of deep tan you only get from decades in the sun. He wore civilian clothes, but carried himself like military. When he saw me staring, he nodded. "You just came from the Delta," he said. Not a question. "Yeah, how'd you know?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Like you have the look. Like you have seen something you cannot explain." I sat down across from him without being invited. "Who are you?" "My name is Laurent Mercier. I was with the Foreign Legion. First Indochina War, 1950 to 1954. I stayed after." He gestured vaguely toward the Delta. "I have a rubber plantation near my Tho. Sometimes I consult for your military. Mostly I drink coffee and remember." "You fought in the Delta?" "For 4 years. The Viet Minh were everywhere then, just like the Viet Cong now. We did patrols, ambushes, all the same operations you do, and we learned the same lessons." He studied me over his coffee cup. "You have seen the tracks, yes? 3 toes. Very deep." My skin went cold. "How do you know about the tracks?" "Because I saw them in 1952 and 1953, and many times after. We called them les hommes lézards, the lizard men. Ridiculous name, but we did not know what else to call them. The Vietnamese had their own names, Ngoy Rong, Ca Sao Ngoy, different words in different villages. But they all meant the same thing. Things that walk like men, but are not men. Things that live in the water." He pulled out a worn leather notebook from his jacket pocket, flipped through pages covered in neat handwriting and sketches. He stopped on a page dated May 1953 and turned it toward me. The sketch showed a humanoid figure, tall and lean, with an elongated head and what looked like scales covering the body. The proportions were wrong, arms too long, legs bent backward at the knee like a bird's, 3-fingered hands ending in claws, and the eyes, even in pencil, looked intelligent. "You saw one," I said. "I saw many. My unit lost 11 men in 2 years to them. Never in daylight, always at night, always near water. Sometimes we would find the bodies, sometimes only blood and equipment. The Viet Minh lost men too. We would find their camps abandoned, just like you did. Or we would hear firefights in the distance and arrive to find nothing but spent ammunition and those tracks everywhere. Did you report it?" Laurent laughed, a bitter sound. "Of course. My commanding officer wrote it up as enemy contact. Every time. Because what else could we write? That monsters killed our men? The generals in Hanoi would have sent us home for psychiatric evaluation." He closed the notebook. But there were whispers. Intelligence officers who collected the reports noticed patterns. Certain grid coordinates where both French and Viet Minh avoided patrolling at night. The areas where casualties were listed as MIA, but the circumstances were unusual. Did anyone ever figure out what they are? Theories, nothing more. Some said they were a species that evolved separately, hidden in the remote waterways. Some thought they were human once, changed by something in the environment. The Vietnamese elders said they have always been here, since before humans built the first villages. Ancient guardians of the Delta, spirits made flesh. He shrugged. I stopped caring what they are. I only care that they are real. He pulled something else from his pocket, a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, I saw a scale, thick as my thumbnail, roughly diamond-shaped, colored somewhere between dark green and black. The surface had an iridescent quality, catching the light like oil on water. I found this in 1953, embedded in a tree where one of them had been. Sent it to a friend in Paris who worked in biology. He could not identify it. Said the cellular structure was reptilian, but the density was wrong. Too strong. He asked where I had obtained it. I never wrote back. I reached out to touch it, but Laurent pulled it away. Keep your distance from them if you can. They are not animals. They think, they plan, They hunt with purpose, and they do not forgive intrusion into their territory. He wrapped the scale again and pocketed it. The delta belongs to them. We are only visitors. The ones who forget this do not come back. He stood up, finished his coffee, and walked away without another word. I sat there for a long time, staring at the delta stretched out in the distance, green and black and alive. And somewhere in all that water, things that had been here long before the war and would be here long after. We went back into the delta 4 days later with new orders. Observe a suspected supply route the Viet Cong were using to move weapons from Cambodia. Intelligence said they ran boats down a particular channel every 3 or 4 nights, always after 2100 hours. Our job was to set up an ambush position, watch the route, and report movements. Not engage unless absolutely necessary. LT picked a spot where 2 channels merged, creating a junction wide enough for boats, but narrow enough that we'd have a clear view. There was a small island in the middle, barely 10 meters across, covered in thick mangrove roots that would give us concealment. We moved into position 2 hours before dusk, waded across the channel in water up to our chests, and settled into the roots. The mosquitoes found us immediately. Phillips whispered that he was going to die from blood loss before the Viet Cong ever showed up. Davis told him to shut up. Jenkins distributed insect repellent that didn't work. LT checked his watch every 5 minutes. I kept my rifle pointed at the water and tried not to think about Laurent's scale. Dusk came fast in the delta. One moment there was light, the next everything was shadows and gray water. We'd been in position for 3 hours when I noticed the silence. It happened gradually. The insects had been a constant hum since we'd arrived, so loud you almost stopped hearing it. But now the sound was fading. Within minutes, it was gone completely. No mosquitoes, no frogs, not even the distant bird calls that usually echoed across the water at night. Just silence so complete, I could hear Phillips breathing 5 meters away. Or Davis noticed it too. I saw him tense, slowly scanning the water with his rifle. Then the water moved. Not a ripple from wind, not the wake from a boat. Movement underneath, disturbing the surface. It was maybe 30 meters south of our position, coming up the channel we were watching. Something large, long, moving steadily against the current. LT raised his hand, the signal to stay quiet and still. The movement came closer. I could track it by the water displacement, a smooth V-shaped wake that didn't match anything I'd seen before. Too controlled for a crocodile, too deliberate. Whatever it was stayed just below the surface, never breaking through. 20 meters away, 15, then it stopped. The wake disappeared. The water went flat. For maybe 30 seconds, nothing happened. We all watched the spot where the movement had ceased, hardly breathing. My finger rested on the trigger guard, every muscle locked. The head broke the surface without a sound. It rose slowly, water streaming off scales that caught the moonlight. The head was elongated, almost crocodilian, but wrong. Too narrow, too angular. And when it lifted higher, I saw the neck, long and muscular, supporting the head at least 4 feet above the waterline. Then it stood up. The body emerged in sections. Shoulders, torso, arms that were too long, ending in hands with 3 fingers and opposable thumbs. It rose to full height and just stood there in the waist-deep water, completely still. 7 feet tall, maybe more. Bipedal. Scales covering every inch of visible skin, dark green and black, almost armored looking. The legs were bent backward at the knee, like a bird's, giving it a hunched but ready posture. I couldn't see its eyes from where I was, but I could feel them. Scanning, searching. It was hunting. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Phillips was closest to me, and I could see his hand trembling on his rifle. LT had his hand still raised, the signal to hold position. Davis had gone absolutely rigid. The creature turned its head slowly, surveying the area. The movement was smooth, controlled, intelligent. This wasn't an animal following instinct. This was something thinking, deciding. When it turned in our direction, I saw its eyes. Even in the darkness, they reflected the moonlight. Yellow-green, vertical pupils, fixed directly on our island. It knew we were there. My heart hammered so hard, I was certain it could hear it. The creature's head tilted slightly, like it was listening, or calculating. Then it took a step toward us, and the water barely moved. Its foot made no splash when it came down. Another step, then another. It was crossing the channel toward our position. LT's hand moved to his sidearm. I saw Davis shift his rifle slightly. Jenkins had stopped breathing entirely. The creature was 10 meters away now, close enough that I could see the texture of its scales, the webbing between its fingers, the way its chest expanded and contracted with breath. 5 meters. Then it stopped again. We stared at each other across the dark water. Predator and prey. It opened its mouth slightly, and I saw rows of teeth designed for tearing. A low sound came from its throat, not quite a hiss, not quite a growl. Something deeper, a sound I felt in my chest more than heard. It held our gaze for what felt like an eternity. Then it closed its mouth, turned slowly, and walked back across the channel the way it had come. It didn't hurry, didn't show any sign of fear or retreat. It simply decided we weren't worth the effort. When it reached the deeper water, it sank below the surface without a ripple and disappeared. The insect started up again 5 minutes later. None of us spoke. LT lowered his hand. We stayed in that position for another 4 hours, watching for the Viet Cong supply boat that never came. When we finally extracted at dawn, wading back across the channel to solid ground, LT stopped us before we moved out. "We saw a crocodile," he said quietly. "That's what goes in the report. A large crocodile. Everyone clear?" We all nodded, but we knew what we'd seen, and we knew it had let us live. The mission went wrong on October 14th, 1968. I remember the date because it was the day I stopped believing we were the apex predators in the Delta. We'd been inserted at dawn to recon a suspected Viet Cong staging area 5 kilometers into the swamp. The insertion was clean, the patrol quiet. We moved through the channels in a loose formation, Davis on point, LT in the middle calling positions, me and Jenkins bringing up the rear. Phillips carried the radio between us. The ambush came at 16:30 hours. We were crossing a wide-open rice paddy when the first shots cracked out from the tree line. Automatic weapons fire, at least 3 positions. We scattered, returning fire, trying to reach the nearest cover. I saw Davis go down, not hit, just diving into a drainage ditch. Phillips was screaming grid coordinates into the radio. LT was directing fire. Then the mortars started. The Viet Cong had us bracketed. Rounds were dropping in a pattern, cutting off our fallback route. LT made the call to split up, break contact in pairs, rally at a secondary position 2 clicks north. He went with Davis and Phillips. I went with Jenkins. We ran. The swamp swallowed us within minutes. Jenkins and I crashed through the mangroves, knee-deep in black water, following a narrow channel that led roughly north. The shooting faded behind us. We kept moving until full dark, until we were certain we'd broken contact, until my lungs burned and my legs were shaking. Jenkins checked his compass with a penlight. We're off course. Went too far east. I looked around. Nothing but mangrove trees in every direction, their roots creating an almost impenetrable maze. Water everywhere, and the surface completely still. How far to the rally point? 3, maybe 4 clicks, but we'd have to cross open water in the dark. We both knew what that meant. Neither of us said it. We find shelter, I said. Wait for dawn. Move at first light. We found a structure 20 minutes later. An old fishing hut on stilts, abandoned and half collapsed but still standing. The floor was about 6 feet above the water, accessible by a ladder that was missing half its rungs. We climbed up carefully, testing each board before putting weight on it. The inside was small, maybe 3 meters square. Holes in the roof let moonlight through. The floor creaked with every movement, but held. We positioned ourselves near the corners where the supports were strongest, rifles pointed at the ladder opening. "We'll do rotating watch," Jenkins said. 2 hours each." Agreed. The firefight had stopped completely now. The delta had returned to its usual night sounds: insects, distant water movement, the occasional bird. Jenkins took first watch. I tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, and something about the silence felt wrong. At 21:30 hours, the insects stopped. Jenkins noticed it the same moment I did. He sat up straighter, scanning the darkness below through the gaps in the floorboards. "You hear that?" "I don't hear anything." "Exactly." We waited, listened. The silence was absolute now, pressing in from all sides. Then I heard the water move. Not flowing, moving. Something displacing it. The sound came from the south, from the direction we'd come. Multiple somethings. I crawled to the edge of the floor, looked down through a gap, and the water below our hut was dark, almost black in the shadows. But I could see ripples spreading out from beneath us. Something was circling. "Jenkins," I whispered. "We're not alone." He moved to the opposite side, looked down. "Jesus, there's more than one." I counted the disturbances in the water. At least 3, maybe 4 separate wakes, all moving around the hut in a slow pattern. Too coordinated to be random, too deliberate to be animals. One of them surfaced. The head rose from the water 15 feet from the hut, moonlight illuminating every detail. Scaled, elongated, those yellow-green eyes staring directly at our position. It was completely motionless, just watching, studying. Then another surfaced on the opposite side. Then a third. They'd surrounded us. "What the hell are they doing?" Jenkins's voice was barely a whisper, tight with fear. "Testing us." As if in response, one of the creatures moved toward the hut. It walked through the chest-deep water on 2 legs, arms at its sides, moving with purpose. When it reached the stilts, it stopped and looked up at us. The intelligence in those eyes was undeniable. This thing was thinking, calculating. It reached out with one 3-fingered hand and gripped the nearest support post. The wood groaned under the pressure. "They're going to try to pull it down," I said, raising my rifle. "Don't shoot," Jenkins hissed. "We fire, we give away our position to the Viet Cong. We don't fire, we're in the water with those things." The creature pulled. The entire hut shifted, tilting slightly. Another creature grabbed a different post. They were working together, coordinating. Jenkins made a decision. He aimed at the nearest one and fired. The crack of the rifle was deafening. The bullet hit the creature high in the shoulder, punching through scales. It released the post immediately and dropped below the water without a sound. The others scattered, disappearing beneath the surface in ripples. We waited, rifles trained on the water, expecting them to rush us, expecting retaliation. But they were gone. The silence lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then the insects started again, slowly at first, then building to their normal volume. Jenkins and I stayed frozen, scanning the water below, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. "Did we scare them off?" Jenkins asked. "I don't think so," Then why'd they leave? I looked at the blood in the water where Jenkins had shot the creature, dark stains spreading slowly across the surface. And because they learned what they wanted to know. They learned we'd fight back. They learned we have weapons. They were testing our defenses. And now? Now they know. We stayed in that hut until dawn, both of us awake, both of us watching. The creatures never returned. But when the sun rose and we climbed down, I saw the marks their hands had left on the support posts. Deep grooves in the wood. Claw marks. They could have killed us. They chose not to. What we experienced that night wasn't unique. And that realization changed everything I thought I knew about the war. We reached the rally point at 0830 hours. LT, Davis, and Phillips were already there, along with 2 other teams who'd been operating in adjacent sectors. Everyone had made it out. No casualties from the ambush. Jenkins and I didn't mention the hut. Didn't mention what circled us in the dark. We just reported that we'd taken shelter overnight and moved at first light. LT nodded, marked us present, and called for extraction. The chopper came an hour later. We loaded up and lifted off, watching the delta shrink beneath us. Green and black water stretching to the horizon. From up there, it looked peaceful, almost beautiful. I knew better now. Back at the firebase, we went through the standard debriefing. LT filed his after-action report, listed the contact with Viet Cong forces, noted that we'd broken contact successfully with no friendly casualties. He made no mention of anything else. Neither did we. I found Jenkins that evening outside the enlisted tent, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. He'd been quiet since we got back, barely said a word during debriefing. When he saw me, he didn't look up. I keep thinking about how they moved, he said quietly. How they worked together. That wasn't animal behavior. That was tactical. I know. Nobody's going to believe this. No, I agreed. They're not. He finished his cigarette and immediately lit another. I'm putting in for transfer. Medical company. Anywhere but the Delta. They'll ask why. I'll tell them I can't handle the stress. They'll believe that. Half the guys here are barely holding it together anyway. He looked at me directly for the first time. You should do the same. I've got 4 months left on my tour. 4 months is a long time in the Delta. He was right, but I didn't transfer. Something kept me there. Maybe I needed to understand what we'd seen. Maybe I just needed to know I wasn't crazy. Jenkins shipped out 2 weeks later. I never saw him again. I started asking questions, carefully, quietly. Found out I wasn't the only one who'd seen things. A staff sergeant from the 9th Infantry Division told me about a patrol that went missing for 3 days near Vinh Long. When they finally stumbled back to base, 2 men were gone, and the rest wouldn't talk about what happened. Just kept repeating they'd gotten lost in the swamp. A Navy riverboat crew described something that had paced their boat for 20 minutes one night, staying just below the surface, keeping perfect speed with them. When they aimed their spotlight at the water, whatever it was dove deep and disappeared. An ARVN ranger showed me a scar on his arm, 4 parallel gouges that looked like claw marks. Said he'd gotten it during a night ambush when something grabbed him from the water. His team fired into the darkness and it let go. He never saw what it was. The pattern was always the same. Nighttime. Water. Something that moved with intelligence and purpose. And nobody ever reported it officially, because who would believe them? I found the answer in a conversation with a Navy chaplain who'd been in country since 1965. He'd heard enough confessions, enough whispered stories, and that he'd started keeping notes. Not official records. Just a personal journal of things that didn't fit the war we were supposed to be fighting. There's an understanding, he told me. Unwritten, unspoken. Both sides have learned it. The Viet Cong don't patrol certain areas at night. Neither do we. There are channels, entire grid squares, where fighting stops after dark. Not because of orders, because of experience. Experience with what? With the things that were here first. The things that consider the Delta their territory. We're guests here. Uninvited guests. And as long as we respect certain boundaries, we're tolerated. When we don't, he didn't finish the sentence. How long has this been going on? The French knew. Before them, the Japanese knew. Before them, the Chinese knew. Go back far enough and you'll find Vietnamese stories from 1,000 years ago describing the same things. Ngoi Rong, water dragons, river guardians, different names for the same reality. So we just accept it? Pretend it's not happening? What choice do we have? Fight a war on two fronts? Against an enemy we can see and an enemy we can't understand? He closed his journal. The creatures don't take sides. They kill Viet Cong just as readily as they kill us. There's a strange equality in that. Both armies lose men to them. Both armies have learned to stay away from certain places. It's the closest thing to a ceasefire this war has. I completed my tour in February 1969. Never saw the creatures again. Never went near the water after dark. When I rotated home, I buried the memories as deep as I could and tried to forget. I didn't succeed. "56 years later, I'm finally ready to tell the truth. I'm 76 now, living in a small town in Pennsylvania where the only water is a creek that runs behind my property. I still don't go near it after dark. Old habits. I've stayed in touch with exactly 3 people from my time in Vietnam. Davis died in 2003, cancer. Phillips runs a hardware store in Oregon and doesn't like to talk about the war. Lieutenant retired as a colonel and sends me a Christmas card every year. We've never discussed what we saw. We don't need to. Jenkins sent me a letter in 1994. Just one letter out of nowhere, 25 years after we last spoke. He said he'd spent decades thinking he'd imagined it, that trauma and exhaustion had created something that wasn't real. Then he'd met a Marine vet at a VA hospital who'd served in the Delta in 1969, and they started talking. The Marine mentioned things in the water, things that walked upright, things that hunted at night. Jenkins said he cried with relief, knowing he wasn't insane. He asked if I ever thought about them. I never wrote back, didn't know what to say. Over the years, I've found others. Quiet conversations at VFW halls, a nod of recognition when someone mentions the Mekong, a few words exchanged that confirm we saw the same things, experienced the same fear, carried the same silence. There are more of us than you'd think. We just don't talk about it publicly. Not until now. I decided to tell this story because I'm running out of time to tell it. Because men like Gunny Hernandez died with people thinking they were crazy. Because Jenkins deserved to know he wasn't alone. Because there are things in this world that don't fit in official reports or rational explanations, and pretending they don't exist doesn't make them disappear. I don't know what those creatures were. Ancient species that evolved in isolation? Something else entirely? The Vietnamese have stories going back centuries, and who am I to say they're wrong? All I know is what I saw, what we all saw. The Delta hasn't changed. It's still there, green and black and alive, still full of channels and swamps and things that move in the darkness. The war ended in 1975, but I guarantee you those creatures are still there, still hunting, still walking upright through water that belongs to them. If you served in the Mekong Delta and you saw something you couldn't explain, something you were afraid to report, you're not alone. You never were. We know what's out there, and it knows we were there. Please like, subscribe if you enjoy this story.